In this video, we will learn about vectors in C++. A vector is a collection similar to an array, but whereas an array is of a fixed size, a vector can increase or decrease in size dynamically. Just like arrays, vectors can only store elements of similar data types, so we can have a vector of integers or a vector of characters, but not a vector that has both integers and characters in it. To begin working with vectors, we need to include the vector header file at the top of the code, which will import it from the C++ standard template library, the STL. Let's look at an example of working with vectors in C++. First, we will create a variable of type vector that stores integer elements, named list. To add an element to a vector, we can use the pushback function. Let's add 2 to our vector of ints by typing list.pushback and passing in 2. After that, we will add the integers 4 and 8 to the list, using the pushback function. We can use a for loop to iterate over each of the items stored in a vector. For example, let's have a for loop that starts at int I equals 0, runs while I is less than list.size, and increments I by 1 each time. Inside of this for loop, we are going to output each of the items in the vector to the console. We can access an element in the vector with its index by using the at function. Let's output list at I, and then a space to the console. When we run the code, notice that each of the elements 2, 4, and 8 was printed out. Let's learn about some more functions that apply to vectors, and see how they would work on our vector named list that we've been working with. To retrieve the first element in a vector, we can utilize the front function. We can print out the string first element is, then a call to list.front, and then a new line character to the console. Obtaining the last element in a vector can be achieved using the back function. For example, we will print out last element is, then make a call to list.back, and then a new line character to the console. To check how many elements are currently stored in a vector, we can use the size function. For example, let's output the string size before clear is, then list.size, and then a new line to the console. We can remove all elements from a vector using the clear function. For example, let's type list.clear, which will remove all of the elements 2, 4, and 8 from our list vector. To check that the clear operation worked properly, we will output size after clear is, then the size of the list, and then a new line to the console. Checking if a vector is empty can be done using the empty function. For example, let's output isEmpty, then list.empty, and then a new line to the console. When we run the code, notice that the first element in our vector is 2, the last element in the vector is 8, the size before the clear is 3, the size after the clear is 0, and isEmpty is equal to 1. Recall that 1 stands for a value of true. To remove the last element from a vector, we can use the popback function. After pushing back 2, 4, and 8 onto our vector, let's make a call to list.popback. Then we will print out each of the elements in the vector using a for loop. When we run the code, notice that the vector only contains 2 and 4, meaning 8 was removed from the vector using the popback function. Another way to add elements to a vector is using the following syntax. Say we create a vector of ints named list2, with a set of parentheses right after the variable name, and pass in 4 as the first argument and 0 as the second argument. The 4 is the size, meaning our vector will hold 4 elements. The 0 is the value for each of the elements. To check that these elements were added to the list correctly, we will iterate over each item in our list2 vector using a for loop, and output them to the console. When we run the code, notice that 4 zeros were output to the console, just like we expected. We can change the value of an element in a vector using its index. For example, we will reference the element at index 0 using the at function and assign it a value of 1. Now, when we run the code, notice that the first element in our list2 vector is 1, and the other 3 values are 0. Another concept relating to vectors is the concept of iterators. An iterator is used to point to the memory address of an element in a vector. An iterator is very similar to the concept of a pointer in C++. For this next example, let's create a vector of characters named list that we assign the character values A, B, C, and D to. Next, we will create a vector iterator by typing vector char, and then 2 colons, then iterator, and then the name of the iterator, which will be I. After that, we will set I to list.begin. The begin function returns an iterator that points to the first element in a vector. To see this, let's output the value that I is pointing to the console. When we run the code, notice that the element at index 0 in our list vector is A. We can also use iterators and for loops. For this next example, let's create a vector of integers named numbers that contains the integer values 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. For iterator it equals numbers.begin, while it does not equal numbers.end, and incrementing I by 1 each iteration, we will output the value of the element it is pointing to the console. When we run the code, notice that 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 were output to the console.